Hi, and welcome everybody. My name is Shelly Palmer, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to NeuroReality, the future of telepresence. Today, we're going to discuss an incredibly exciting area of biomedical research and applied science, the fusion of humans and machines. But before we get started, it's my honor to introduce the Provost and Executive Vice President of Case Western Reserve University, Ben Vincent III.
Good morning, Shelly. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am thrilled to be here today, and I am absolutely thrilled, Shelly, that you've joined us for what I'm sure is going to be an absolutely amazing and informative event. Now, some of you may know, at Case Western Reserve University, we have a long history of embracing technology, especially as it interfaces with the human element. Now, you may not know this, but the first full body scan was done at Case Western Reserve University in the 1800s. The first neurosimulator was implanted by a researcher at Case Western Reserve University, and we formed the first biomedical engineering department. Now, these are just a few of the examples here at Case Western Reserve University where we have exhibited leadership in biomedical engineering and neural interfaces. And we continue to innovate today. Now, the conversation that you'll be hearing embodies who we are as an institution. At Case Western Reserve, we use technology to deepen and enrich the disciplines, but always keeping the human element at the center. We champion excellence in improving humanity, and this is one of the core strengths of our university, and some even call it our secret sauce. But we know that as humanity and technology become increasingly intertwined, it will also raise ethical and philosophical questions about what it means to be truly human in today's world. Now, that's why we want to remain at the forefront of examining how technology and people are connecting. We want to unleash this campus's creativity across all of our disciplines. We want to catapult our research, our teaching, and our learning in the process. Now, the Human Fusions Institute, under the leadership of Dustin Tyler, is leading the way. Dustin and his team are partnering across schools at Case Western Reserve and with other universities throughout the country. They are working on making tech accessible to all, reducing the digital divide. They're advancing the human social community. They're improving human health, expanding human performance, and extending the human reach. All of this with an eye towards equity and with the mission of breaking down divisions and creating a future in which everyone can fully benefit from technology's advancements. Dustin, I am ever grateful to you and your team for the work that you've been doing and for presenting the very best of Case Western Reserve University. And now, without further ado, let's get this conversation started. Back over to you, Shelly.
Ben, thanks so much for your kind remarks. Truly, truly appreciated. So let's talk about human fusion. A few years back, I wrote an article entitled "The 5 Jobs Robots Will Take First." And I followed it up a week later with, guess what? The 5 Jobs Robots Will Take Last. Those articles really weren't about robots. They were about advances in AI and machine learning. And I guess more specifically, they were about the idea that the best human-machine partnerships would be best positioned to win. Humans can't ingest or analyze big data, and computers aren't human. So if you put the two together, you really have the best of both worlds. Now, the only thing that made those writings controversial was that the jobs I listed were thought to be only doable by humans. People had a lot of trouble wrapping their heads around the concept that machines running software that could enable them to do cognitive, non-repetitive work like white-collar work were ever going to be a threat. Today, though, I think everyone truly understands that the best, most productive, most desirable outcomes are almost always the product of humans who are trained to become expert tool users, whether that tool is a hammer or a piano or a Formula One race car or a computer running an AI model. The people who leverage the most advanced technology and do it well generally have a significant edge. I was introduced to Dustin Tyler a few months ago when I was fortunate enough to see a video about the work he and his colleagues were doing in biomedical engineering. The more I learned about human-machine fusion or biomedically enhanced human-machine partnerships, the more I wanted to learn. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Dustin Tyler, the director of the Functional Neural Interface Lab and the Human Fusions Institute at Case Western Reserve University. Dustin, so great to have you here.
Thanks, Shelly. It's an honor to talk to you today. I appreciate having me.
So I've got one big question. What is NeuroReality?
NeuroReality is the direct connection through the nervous system between humans and technology, where we don't change the human, but we allow us to engage in technology in a very different way than we've done up till now.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's get into it.
So basically, this is the idea of we're creating an ecosystem around the concept of NeuroReality, directly connecting humans and technology over the nervous system at the very fundamental level.
And when I think about connecting human beings at the most fundamental level, I've been using tools for hundreds of thousands of years. I mean, apes are tool users, right? We've figured it out from sticks and stones right up to the present. But we've always used our tools. Now the concept is we're going to fuse with our tools. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure. So the idea is, as you said, we've used tools. We've had this relationship with technology where I pick it up, I hold it. It's the physical interaction with that tool is how I use it. That's because we've been limited by the hands, by the muscles, by the sensors that we have. What we're moving towards now is an idea of more of an embodiment of the technology. And what that means is rather than you and the technology being separate. So when I pick up a tool, I know I'm holding a tool and it's different than I am. But what we're saying, because we can directly connect to the nervous system, and what we're doing now is, say, taking information from a sensor on a robotic hand, right? So rather than driving it with a joystick or something I can hold and push, I'm getting that sensor information, and now it can go in the technology we're developing goes directly into my nervous system, and in fact, it will feel like my hand. And so that sensor information directly goes into those channels that used to come from my finger, or still come from my finger, come from the finger, and then puts that information on the same channels, and the brain interprets it as my finger. And so now, rather than my finger manipulating something that manipulates the robot and feels it, I actually am the robot. I embody that experience for what it is. And the beauty is it's something I can go into and be that robot at one moment and simply turn it off and not be that robot. I'm not replacing myself. I'm just connecting in a new way to it. So it's sort of the evolution of how we work with technology. It's not a change in who we are. It's just the next level of how we connect with technology.
So the fundamental tool set you're using is an area called haptics or haptic feedback. And we've seen that in the past. Video gamers have haptic feedback. Your iPhone has, most phones have haptic feedback. You touch it and it's a glass screen, but the button feels like you pressed it. So this is the next level. How is it different from the technology we're used to, the haptic technology we're used to?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these ideas of haptic feedback and all these have been around since forever, frankly. And in all those cases, the device that you're holding and operating is somehow shaking, vibrating, doing something to give you a sensory substitution. It makes you feel something in the device that you interpret to be an effect. The difference here is it's actually part of you in many ways, right? So that information comes in and now it is your hand. It's not your hand vibrating. It's not something external. It's actually you're feeling your hand do that activity. So it becomes much more of a part of you as a connection as it's actually being my hand touching something as opposed to something vibrating in my hand. You know, and it's interesting that if you look at even from the 60s, and Norbert Wiener talked about this idea of cyberkinetics and how the human works. We process information in context, right? So when the brain feels something vibrate in their hand, there's a context that it's holding something in the hand. Whereas when we go directly to the nervous system, it comes in the same channels. It's not something I'm holding in the hand. It's just information that's arisen from what I'm doing. So I feel that hand. So the context with which we interpret that information is very different. It becomes part of us. And so it's an evolution, right? I mean, we're not doing something new. It's not like the idea is completely foreign, but the way we interact is very different. There's one other aspect of this that I think is,
Sure.
There's one other aspect of this too, is that the device vibrated. Right? So everything that's to be haptic has to have some form of feedback. And that feedback can be different for every device. We have to relearn it for everything. In this case, where we're actually providing a connection that's much more direct to the nervous system, every device is haptic because you can connect to the same connection, right? So if I have a haptic connection, if I have a NeuroReality connection, every device in the world by software becomes haptic, because now we can connect to that information stream that we're applying. And so you don't have to vibrate the phone. You just send a signal that says, hold hand. Imagine emojis right now, right? You send a heart emoji. Sure. And then, oh, that's nice. I actually have emojis for my mother. She'll send like 6 strings of them because she can't quite convey what she wants to in this emoji. But we could do something different where you could actually send them an idea of holding their hand. So now you can send something where they feel it. So it's just the data that's being sent, the same thing, but you can squeeze somebody's hand, for example, by just sending that digital stream, and they will actually feel you holding their hand. So it really changes the way that we create the haptic interface and what we can be haptic, and is how we can interpret that, because it's part of who you are.
So there are lots of different approaches to this. Elon Musk is going to open up your skull and stick some electrodes in there, and he's going to tickle your brain, and your brain's going to feel a certain way. But you guys aren't working on that kind of technology. You have a different interface. Can you explain the difference a little bit?
For sure. So when we talk about interfacing with the human nervous system, we have to remember that that's a pretty complex system, right? Everything from what we think about when we think about brain-machine interfacing and talking to the brain, there's the brain itself, which is what's in this part of our body. The rest of it, though, is the peripheral nervous system. These are the things that connect to our arm, that actually move out. And, if I have the sensors in my fingertip, from here, there's a connection that runs ultimately to the brain. We are tapping into the external part. So it's not exclusive. I mean, essentially within this ecosystem of human fusions, we're open to talking with everybody. In the lab right now, and the work that we've been doing has been focused maybe out here in the arm, so the nerves we're connecting to are not in the brain, but they're out here. And I think, one of the things that is important is to understand that by connecting to the peripheral system, you're engaging all the aspects of that system along the way. If you're connected to the brain directly, you're connected to just a small part of the brain. And there's a lot of implications of that we think are important. And that's part of where the research is at. By analogy, you can think about just a computer system, if you will. When you work with your computer, you type on the keyboard. That's the peripherals, right? I mean, that's where the words come from. And you program a very complex CPU that does activity. So we're actually interacting at that CPU or at the peripheral level. A brain interface is like going in and tapping into that CPU and trying to hit each transistor to make the CPU do its job. You're bypassing all the graphics processors, all the numerics and everything else, and trying to work at the transistor level.
Is it fair to say that the way you're approaching this philosophically allows more of your physiology as a person to be involved in the decision making and the interpretation of the signals, as opposed to, is it less reductionist? Is that the philosophy?
That's what we think. I mean, again, the whole idea of human fusions is inclusive. We're looking for everybody to explore this problem, and maybe it's better to work directly in the brain. From where we're looking now, though, and from the work we've had with amputees and what's been kind of began with this and providing sensation to prosthetics, we in fact have done some research that's looking at the difference of directly in the brain versus in the periphery, and that engagement of this circuitry, both at the conscious and then of course the preconscious level. So there's lots of stuff we do in the day in our brain that we don't think about. For example, if you reach out to grab a glass on the table or take a drink from a cup, it would be impossible for me to tell you every single muscle and how it's coordinated to do that. I don't even think about it. I'm not even aware of it. That's happening at a different level than my conscious intent of reaching for the cup. And so there's a lot of circuitry, there's a lot of pieces of the brain, and it's not just the motor control. When you touch somebody, there's an emotional component, right? So there's a lot of other aspects about who we are as people that also comes from touch that gets split into different parts of the brain when it comes up and comes in. So we're working from the idea that the further you are towards the edge, the end of that system, the more of that physiological system, both on the input and the output, frankly, right? So I can include the touch, it comes into the brain, captures all that processing along the way, goes out, and a lot of other neuroscience pieces that we think are very interesting, gets processed in everything that we do, and then goes back to an activity of when I close my hand, how hard I close my hand to hold somebody's hand if I'm shaking their hand, all that stuff. If I can capture that near the end, then we've kind of used the brain, which is really the impressive thing to me. We're not trying to replace the brain. In fact, what we're really trying to do is engage the entirety of the brain, put the human in the loop with the technology, and actually imbue it with what the human's really good at.
So the implications of this are pretty spectacular. I want to just stay on the how for a minute, and then we're going to talk about the what and the why. Yep. So in order for me to fuse with technology, regardless of of how the technology is crafted, it's going to need feedback mechanisms that I can interpret. So the technical part of this is that I've got my upper arm is still here and my lower arm is missing. What has to go on me? What has to go in the prosthetic? What are the technical requirements, like the baseline technical requirements for this to work?
Sure. So you've talked about this in the way you presented this, based on the work we've been doing with people with limb loss. So they're missing an arm. In that case, we put technology directly inside the individual because they're missing their limb, but that's not required. I mean, you can still have your arm and still take advantage of this technology. What we do is, and what's important is that we have to interact with the nerves themselves. So just like if you're, basically in the system, you have sensors and communication. We're trying to tap into that communication. And, I think we have to be careful, and we use the term fuse, but it has very specific meanings. It doesn't mean like welding or fusing together. What we're actually doing is fusing information. But the way we do this is we put basically, and this is where 30 years of my career and, 60 years of a lot of development have come in, is how do we put a connection to that nervous system, to those wires, the neurons in the body, that don't cause them to change, that actually allows them to function normally. And when it's important, we can just add extra information on top of that. So we have a couple different ways of doing that without getting too much into the detail, but it's everything from devices on the surface of the skin, but they're not as good, to a full implant for somebody that has like spinal cord injury or limb loss. But we're working on technology too. And this is why it's an exciting time, why we're actually pushing this forward at an institute. You go through the hype cycle of sci-fi that says you can do whatever, but people don't buy any of it. Then you go through the hype cycle of the first thing that's shown in the lab, and suddenly the technology is going to change the world and get Black Mirror and all these other things overhyped. We're at the point now where reality is setting in. We actually can do this work. And so we're working on technology now that will basically be like a shot at most in terms of the interface. So you can go in, you can basically, as you get a shot or something else, you can now have this connection. And it's, and critical is it doesn't change the way you function normally. It's there. If you use it, it's great. If you don't, it's not, right? So a lot of people have these ideas of this technology taking over our body. And that's not what we're doing. I mean, those are sci-fi types of issues. And what we're trying to do is more directly just talk to that nervous system, apply a conduit where we can provide information and record information, but that's it.
So that brings us perfectly to the most logical next question. I've now advanced to the point where instead of picking up a tool, I can attach myself to the tool and still command it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things change in our world. We have high bandwidth, low latency networks that are nascent in stage, but they exist around us. Wi-Fi 6 or 6E is here. 5G is here. We've got the ability to really interface with technology at the edge in a way we haven't in the past, and that's accelerating. And so I'm not limited to a limb attached to my forearm. I can be working on the space station. I can be doing something half a world away. I'm limited only by the speed and efficacy of the network topology and the interface. So
as far as the networking technology, that's actually part of the reason now is the right time for this. It's becoming to the level of capability where we can actually include human experience. And I can talk more about that in a minute. But just to go back to the beginning, and this is where I got really excited about this. I've been working in limb loss and prostheses. And we worked with one of our subjects and we asked them, what's it like when you have haptic feedback and when you don't? We have the sense of touch. When they don't, they talked about a tool on the end of their arm. But as soon as we turned this touch on, they didn't really even answer the question. They just started talking about using their hand to do things. So their language changed entirely. When we started to think about this, exactly what you're saying is what we did. We said, well, the fact that it's on his arm and we call it a prosthesis are two arbitrary things. It's a robotic system and it can be anywhere. So we could take that same arm and put it in Paris. We're in Cleveland. We could put it in Paris, or as we've done recently, put it at UCLA with our colleagues there. And it still feels the same to them. It's the same process. So now what really, when you think about the part of this, right, the thing that's very exciting is you start to think about what is our experience limited by? And it's been limited by our skin. That's the extent of how I can feel things. That's my extent to the environment. But now I can get rid of that. I can put your sensors, what the skin is, anywhere in the world, and then provide that data back to the same channels, and it still feels like your hand. So now you're no longer limited in your existence, if you will, and so where you perceive yourself to be by the skin, the physical limits of your body. So now we can digitize experience, right? And so the two main things we have to work on are this idea of NeuroReality, how we connect to the individual, and then the network infrastructure to make that real. So what does the experiential network look like? Those are the two kind of technological areas we're dealing with. You mentioned, 5G, 6G as it comes, Wi-Fi 6. These are all critical technologies. If you think about watching Netflix right now, it buffers when it starts, right? And it sets enough data in there that you never see it stop, but it's running behind reality. You can't do that with a human experience. And this is why the ultra wide bandwidth stuff, the high bandwidth communications, low latency, no latency. When you think about how, if I'm controlling my hand across the country, when I do something within 100 milliseconds, my idea to create it, to go out and for it to do it and come back and be experienced, that's the limit of time. So 100 milliseconds is long electronically, but it's not long when we start thinking about the system we're working on. And so the real critical key here is that I think the infrastructure, the networking is asking, what can we do with this high speed? And we're saying, finally, you're coming close to what we can do. So it's a perfect merger in time of advancing technology and what we need to make this real.
Just a level set, it takes you 300 to 400 milliseconds to blink your eyes. Anything below 10 milliseconds, a human being perceives as being simultaneous. At 5 or 6 milliseconds, you literally can't tell. At 7 milliseconds, you hear a kind of a rasp, and sonically, your ears can tell that you're hearing two sounds, but you can't tell which one is first or second. So this is, I think the stat I know the best is the baseball stat, right? How fast a pitcher throws a baseball at 95 miles an hour, and how fast you register the fact that the ball is leaving the pitcher's hand. And when you have to start to swing the bat, you have about 7 milliseconds to make a decision as to whether you want to swing at that pitch or not, which is, for a brain, a very tough thing to do. So human beings don't tend to react. I think the fast twitch driver test, when you see a red light and step on the brake, or you see something emergent, is also very close to half a second, 400 or 500 milliseconds. So we're not that great. I mean, human beings aren't that great from a latency perspective as to when you think to do something and when you actually do it.
So there's a lot of different studies that look at what is synchrony in the different senses. So you're right, the numbers come anywhere from roughly around 70 to 100 is sort of the visual tactile synchrony range, right? When you see it, when it actually happens to you feel it, you got about 70 milliseconds. So that's kind of what we've seen in our results. And then, even, and we won't talk too much, but even binaural hearing, right? The difference in time between two signals is very, very short, but that allows you to locate by just subtle differences. So, even though the response time, that data is processed in a way that's very critical. So our brain becomes really tuned to timing. And this gets into this concept of NeuroReality and actually what it means as well. And Gerard Lanier and all these people that really started the whole, virtual reality. And we all know whenever one sense isn't matched up with another correctly, we get that really weird feeling. It's one of the challenges they worked hard with, right? In terms of acceleration versus visual. So really the creating reality is all about getting all the timing of the senses correct. And so this is where it becomes very critical. And one of the areas that we need to really work on technically as well as physiologically is, how do we make sure those data streams come in synchronized appropriately? And that, again, as we said, and you hinted at, when I do something, if it takes 3 seconds for it to come back, I no longer feel like I did it, right? There's this delay. So we want to keep that within 100 milliseconds. So there's a lot of really interesting, and I think really challenging and exciting technical challenges that really are exciting to me. Again, why Human Fusions is, we think, important right now is to bring all the expertise for this together and focus it on making this happen, right? We're at that cusp where we can't do it yet, but we're really close. And if we put the effort there, it's going to open up and change this whole thing. And
so the way that a lot of big tech companies approach this is they build platforms, and they open the platforms up to a lot of third parties who can create value. And certainly a multi-sided extensible platform creates the most amount of value, because not only can they interface with you and your work, but they can interface with each other. Do you guys have plans to do stuff like that?
Yeah, we've already started that, actually, and we think that's a critical part. It's one of the two critical pieces that I think has to develop here, because we're doing experiential data. So what does that look like? And fundamentally as well, when you do the platform, who's connected to the other side? So think about this, where I have to dedicate a connection between, say, a user and a prosthesis, so using a specific robotic system. That's fine for that connection, but it's not going to be very ubiquitous, right? It's not going to be an app developer that can do whatever they want, or a hardware developer that can put something onto this system. So what we think is important, we're working on this universal translator, if you will. So what is the fundamental language of human experience? And so once we define that as a common data language, or as this basic platform, and open source that to people to be able to tap into, you can now develop a device on the other end and say, here's what the generic haptic data looks like. Put it into that system, route it. So if I type in my web address to device X someplace, as long as I know that it's going to give me haptic information and it's going to take muscle EMG information by a common language, I don't care what's on the other end. When I developed the system connected to the human, we talked about the neural interface stuff, the NeuroReality pieces. I just give it capability and I put it on there. The device on the other end doesn't care how that capability came in, but it just knows it gets capability. And so that allows us to basically now connect out to devices of whatever type. I could type in one moment to be on a robot in California, or another moment being a robot in UCL at Carnegie Mellon with our colleagues there. But the capabilities of robots might be different as well. So I might only feel one finger on one robot, but I might feel my whole hand on another. And so by having this common interface and open sourcing it, this way I went back to, we talked a little bit earlier about this idea of every device becomes haptic. As long as you can write to that interface, as long as you can develop the software that connects on this common language, it's haptic. It's in fact experiential and human connected.
When you think about a standardized language, or like MIDI for music, or I mean, there's some HTML for web browsers. I mean, they're everywhere. So a haptic standard makes sense. What are some of the jobs you'd think? What are some of the areas you think this would most apply to?
So we think that an open standard like this is going to have several different layers of importance, right? So everything from the network infrastructure, there's going to be a whole bunch of development for that. So the engineering, the teams to do that and set up that infrastructure. So as we talked about earlier, latency and everything else is handled through there. Security, right? So now think about this, and it's a big issue nowadays in security and information, but now you're putting your entire experience on the web. So this is a whole nother level of wanting to make sure that you own that domain, et cetera. So what is the security around that? So there's a whole bunch of software development and thought and ethics around those pieces. But then also the hardware developers. Well, how do I make a device that's haptic, keeping in mind all the physiology? So people that understand the psychology, the neuropsychology of sense and touch and interaction and embodiment, those people are going to work directly or be themselves the experts that understand how that with a device interacts, right? So right now there's an awful lot of that goes on in user interface. We call it UX, UI, whatever you want to call it. That to the next level. Now think of it as a neural interface or a NeuroReality interface. So what is it now if I can have real-time feedback? How is that going to change the way that I interact with a website or buying a product or using a device that's across the country or next to me or wherever it happens to be? So there's many different levels, from the device and the hardware builders to the human interface builders, those that work between them, open source software development, everything.
The applications seem almost infinite, from industry to the military to research to education to gaming. I mean, performance. I mean, have you guys thought of? Obviously, you started with prosthetics because it's such an obvious place to start, but this can go almost anywhere.
Yeah, so we tend to think about it. We kind of organize it in three major buckets right now. We've got healthcare, so we continue the prosthetics work, but also a couple areas we're looking at, and the pandemic has brought this up, is remote healthcare. If you talk to any physician, and we talk to lots of them, we work with many of them, the touch, the ability to interact and touch directly with their patient is critical to care. And so while there's some degree of remote medicine and telemedicine now, where you can look at the person, talk to them kind of like we're doing on Zoom here, you can't feel the neck. You can't actually reach out and do a physical exam. And so I think we're working with this healthcare avatar concept of how do we actually build a remote system that the doctor now is through NeuroReality connected through this idea of being in that system and touching, doing laying of hands, and working with the patient directly.
Wow.
And that's a kind of it's a game changer in the way that medicine is delivered, right? So we can almost go back to the home healthcare delivery, so back to this idea of the house call. You don't have to travel. So now if you have the expert in say Cleveland, in an area of medicine and needs to interact with somebody that's in rural North Dakota, you don't have to fly in there. You can just go there and be potentially working with them immediately, and just by typing a web address of where they're at.
Just to switch gears for 1 second, if you can do that, then a grandmother in Cleveland can hug her grandchild in North Dakota or in Europe. It's a whole other way to think about being, which opens up some crazy conversations. Let's talk about what the implications are for this. And then, of course, the ethics thereof. Like now we're starting to get into places that we're touching the what we understand to be the fiber of humanity, like the essence of being human and our ability to sense and feel.
I love the example of just hugging your granddaughter or hugging, your grandmother or whatever at some place. We can look at it as opening up who we are, and the security and ethical issues I think are really important. But like everything, there's a plus side. Imagine if you're not disconnected anymore. We move, right? Families disperse across the country for job and across the world for different things. But imagine if technology can keep us still closer together, right? We've done this with, if you think about the evolution of technology, look what happened when the radio and television started, right? Those are two senses, audio and visual. Really what we're doing is on the next revolution in my mind to start this with now touch. So think of how much we move forward with the audio and visual connections, and really virtual reality and augmented reality are sort of the epitome, right? Those are the pinnacle of that at this moment. But now add that third dimensional information, that stream, that tactile information. And I think that's going to open up because of the things we've talked about earlier, as well as the personal interaction. That's a whole nother revolution in how technology brings us together in ways that we haven't done before. And so I think this is really critical from that perspective. And it's really exciting from that.
I mean, when you think about it, Dustin, audio is a low focus activity unless you make it high focus. You can do almost anything while listening to audio. You drive a car, you can go running, you can exercise, you either pay attention to it or you don't. Add video. Video is high focus. I mean, you can ignore it, but if you're going to watch a video, you're watching a video. And then the audio has an incredibly important job as someone who spent most of my life writing and producing music for television. I can tell you that you don't notice the audio unless it's bad. Right. It's a thankless job writing music to go in the background of television commercials and television shows. But when you add touch now, and we have conventions of watching a two-dimensional image, and we know that we have to suspend our disbelief. We know it's a two-dimensional screen. We also know how to sit in a movie theater, right? We know how to sit in a theater to watch a stage play. When you add touch, now it becomes a totally high focus thing. Right now we're in it. Like now we've changed our relationship dramatically with what's coming in, with what we are sensing is coming in. So I think there's a lot to there. I mean, it almost is more than you could think about from wow, I could do this and I could do that and I could do that. I mean, my first question when I think about this kind of network and this idea is that how far will we be able to enhance the sensors? Like how far can we take the sensors and how complicated do they need to be in order for us to really, I'm going to say trick, that's a wrong word, our bodies into believing we're touching something that's, half a world away. Like what's really technically required and is it much simpler than I think it is? I don't know the answer.
I think the answer is both. And let me put it this way. This is actually talked a lot about in virtual reality and the need for fidelity and vision. You can see what's happening and understanding an environment with a very low fidelity.
Yes.
But it doesn't feel real until it's incredibly real into what your brain is used to in the normal world. Think of one example here that can help us understand this question is think of cochlear prosthetics, right? So this is a very successful direct connection to the auditory system. In the earlier cochlear devices, our ear can hear ranges from 10 hertz, 20 hertz, up to 20 kilohertz,
yep.
Right? That's a really wide spectrum of audio. But yet the devices that were put in, the early devices, had 8 different channels they could actually interact with that system. Now they're up to 32. That is nowhere near the full spectrum of the audio signal. Yet, that device is good enough, and a lot of development to get there, where you can hear conversational speech. You can't, I mean, music is still awkward, and doing conversation in a crowded room is hard, but you can still make a very significant gain off of what you're doing. I'll tell you a short story about the value of just a limited amount of touch. One of our subjects from the prosthetics, from the missing limb loss group, I asked him, when I first met him, I didn't know whether to shake his hand, and I was kind of new in this whole area, and he had lost his right hand. And so, do you shake the prosthetic? Do you shake his left? I was all confused, right? Yeah. So I got to know him over a period of time, and I asked him, I says, what do you normally do? And he says, well, I usually give them the prosthesis, but I don't close it because I don't want to squeeze their hand too hard. And if I can't feel it, I don't know whether or not I'm going to injure them. So I said, well, you have sensation now with this project. Shake my hand. I want to see what that was like. And so he did it first without squeezing. He just gave me that. And it was the proverbial wet fish. It was actually really uncomfortable to me. I don't have the sensory feel. I'm normal, but I was working with him. Mm-hmm. What really struck me about this is when then he closed his hand, it wasn't that it squeezed a little bit. That was nice, but that I felt it modulate. He was actually opening and closing that hand slightly. So there's this nonverbal communication, which is really important. The other thing about that is I said, well, what do you feel? Now, we had only turned on so he could feel his first 3 fingers. And he said, well, I'm pinching you. But then we only turned on one down here. And then I squeezed his hand back. He said, I felt you squeezing my hand. So just having one extra, the brain filled in the gap to say that's picking the whole hand. So even at a very low level number of sensors, we can make a huge gain. It's kind of an 80-20 rule. It's not perfect. We've got a lot of room to go, which is what's exciting. There's still development to do. But even with this limited amount of interface to this point, it still makes an incredible impact to the reality of what it is. And again, because it's coming in the normal channel, it's not a sensory substitution. It's directly on that nerve. The brain is processing it as though it's a normal piece of information. So, and if you think about the brain, again, is an amazing thing. It fills in the gap. Optical illusions are a classic example of this, right? If you only see part of the picture, the brain fills in the rest.
Yes.
Sensory is the same way. It'll fill in a lot of those gaps for us. So the brain does a lot of our job for us, which is really quite exciting.
So let's talk about the Institute for a second. This is a brave new world. This is a completely new area. It requires people from every kind of discipline, purely academic, applied research, applied engineering. What are your hopes and dreams?
Yeah, so the Institute has actually been phenomenal. We have great partners at UCLA working on robotic systems, cognitive neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon. We've got colleagues up at the University of Wyoming that have this virtual cave and trying to understand how that works. We've been working with Cleveland State, which is the ethics and phenomenology of this. And we have a group down in Tuskegee that we're working with, thinking about adoption and diversity and making sure everybody has access. The thing that I've loved about that, and it is my hope for the human fusions, and what all of our hope is actually working together on this, is that there's such a diversity of thought about what this is. It's looking at the full spectrum. So everything from, and the way we organize this around this concept of technology is a small part. That's, can we build it, right? That's sort of the beginning. But then we start looking at this cycle, if you will, of what we're looking at. Is that then the ethics come in. It's like, well, what should we do, right? So technology itself has no conscience, but we have to think about this from the beginning before we create something that's hard to correct. So ethics, right from the beginning, there's philosophical conversations. We're not very philosophical today, but some of my real joy is when we can talk about what's it mean to be human, and where's the boundaries, and what is your boundary, and who is, all these types of questions. What do I own? What's my experience? That's the ethics of it, which is really fascinating conversations around Kant and everything else. And then once you start to give a framework, then you got to have the regulatory environment, right? So the legal side of how do you ensure that the ethically correct is what happens as you move into the entrepreneurship? Because if we build it to 2 people, it's not very useful. How do we get the right thing into the society? And we look at the societal effects, and then of course we continue this loop. So everything, and this is why it's an institute, an exciting thing is we need multiple partners, everything from multiple schools at our university that range from the sociology, the phenomenology, medicine, engineering, the whole gamut is engaged in the conversation. And it kind of goes back to the days of yore of the academy, where it was about the whole thinking and not just I'm an engineer, which I really am excited about working at this. I'm a biomedical engineer by training. A lot of my colleagues are, but it's working at that boundary between the human and engineering, and the ethics and human engineering, the philosophy and engineering. I mean, all these come together, and what you get out of it is a much richer thing than just building widgets and building things as an engineer. And so I I'm really excited about the structure where we have partners across the country, and we're hoping to grow that, right? What we think the Human Fusions Institute is an ecosystem. It's a group of people that have all the different inputs, and we're trying to say, haptics isn't new, you know that, right? We've talked about this before. Our techniques are a little bit unique, and the technology is reaching the point we can do it. But we need to bring that together to sort of create that critical mass where we're looking to push this forward in a much more structured way. And that's what we want, Human Fusions to be, is that ecosystem where we can drive that future. We want the visionaries, the people that go, I see what the future is. I see how this is cool. And I've had those conversations. We could talk for hours. I could with you, I'm sure, here. And I know we have a time limit, but this is really just a lot of fun. We want to bring those people in and think about that future and know it's real, right? And how do we make it real and separate what's not real and what is, and what, so all of that. So that's what the Human Fusions is about, is that ecosystem of all these different ideas coming together on this common goal of bringing the human technology relationship to the next level.
So you're open to having physicists and metaphysicists, you're ethicists and theologians and people who are just interested in what it is to be human, as well as people who have real practical needs. I want to go defuse bombs and not risk first responders. I want to be able to go look for mines in minefields without anyone being in danger. Like this is a full range, and you're as an institute, you're open to having opposing points of view, because everyone's not going to go, this is awesome. Like there's stuff here that's right on the border of what it means to be, and not to get weird, but on the border of what it means to be human. Like this is a conversation that's not hypothetical in this context.
Yeah, not only, I would say welcoming is too weak of a statement. We are actively seeking. This is exactly what we want, because, anybody that doesn't listen to the negative argument, as long as they're rational, you want to think about this and actually address the problem, right? Not just kind of make up stuff, right? But rational thought, I think these are the most enjoyable conversations to me, right? I'm very limited in my view. I don't, and I'm surrounded by a bunch of great people. And I can tell you that what I think today is very, very different than what it was when I started, as well as my colleagues, because we have dialogues that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so not only am I welcoming it, I'm actually actively asking for it. This is what we want to be successful. And we want it from everything from even the people that say you shouldn't, but give me a reason why. And then so let's find out where the common ground is. Because there's lots of reasons. You mentioned a few. For ethics, you might say, well, you shouldn't be able to reach out to technology like that. That's going to happen every technological revolution. Yet at the same time, I'm going to have the grandmother that wants to hug their son across the country, or the person that's dying that wants to feel the hand, or the doctor that wants to provide benefit. Or as you said, the soldier that we don't want to have to send to defuse the bomb directly. We want to send their avatar out there to do it, and all kinds of things. So nothing is as simple as you should or shouldn't. And the only way we get to an answer that makes sense is we have the dialogue amongst all, right? And I think that, I was just reading an article the other day. It's talking about technology, and we start to think about the ethics of technology that we want it to be, not what it really can be. And I think that what I like about the conversations we have at the Human Fusions Institute is that we have the ethicists and the philosophers and the people that dream, even the sci-fi writers, the humanities, right? What could it be? But we can temper that by what reality is, right? So there's a lot of books that write about how we're going to interface the brain, and it's going to change the brain, and we're going to store memories and all that. Technologically, we're not there, right? So those discussions, while interesting in a sci-fi book, shouldn't drive us today, and they could drive us negative or positive. So if we can have the technologists in the room and say, here's a realistic view and it's a real problem, and others that are like, that's great, I love the book, but it's not really relevant. So we can put these together and we have a really productive conversation, which is very exciting.
So if I wanted to get involved and I wanted to be part of this institute, what do I have to do?
Yeah, so we're looking for, you can go to our website at www.humanfusions.org with an S. You can send us an email from there. You can connect to, we have a contact page. We'd love to see people come in. And again, like I said, we want people to engage. We're looking for everything from the corporate to the academic to the government, to the community. Actually, I think this is one thing too we didn't touch on earlier, but it's really important, is the community. This, we don't want to develop this as an ivory tower, and we don't want to develop it at exclusion of others. We need the community in talking to us. And even if it's simple as we can have this conversation, we're kind of, I think, on the same page here, thinking about augmentation, et cetera. The community is not going to necessarily think the same way. And so we're not going to do ourselves any favor by ignoring what's out there in terms of concepts. So we have to engage that conversation right away. And then the other thing is we're trying to make sure that this is not another technology that divides us, kind of the digital divide or whatever words you want to use. This needs to be inclusive. Everybody needs to benefit from this. The capabilities of what we can do is going to allow us to potentially not be limited by having a car or not having a car or all kinds of different things that we think it's critical that this technology enables people, not certain people, but people. And so everything across that spectrum. So again, like I said, in translational, how are we going to get it out there? If we just think about it, it's not very useful. And we know that the Human Fusions Institute is sort of in that pre-competitive space. We're looking at the 10-year, but it's not going to succeed unless we have partners that are looking at what parts can we pull out and how do we get there. One of the things I think about from the commercial standpoint is the cell phone. I love an ad in the 1965, paper of the first Motorola where they show the cell phone as this huge radio in the trunk of a car. It probably cost more than the car and there may have been one tower. Totally useless. If somebody were to look at it from that perspective and say, oh, this is never going anywhere, right? Now everybody has a cell phone. It's more ubiquitous than electricity. So I think we're kind of at that phase. So we need the people to develop the cell phone, the technology, develop it correctly. And we also need the commercial partners to start pushing the infrastructure and how we move these things out. So we want everyone to join us from that perspective. The Human Fusions website or humanfusions@case.edu as an email will get us contact from that perspective.
Before we go, Dustin, I want to bring this back to something that is really practical and personal. You've had some amazing successes with the work you've done, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about the clip I want to play right now.
I've been completely inspired by the work by the people. The work is interesting. That's what I do. But talking to the people is what made this real to me. We ask everybody why they want to be part of the program. And we think, they've lost their hand. They want the function of a hand. Not a single person has said that. This gentleman said, when I lost my hand, it was incredibly traumatic. And I have a granddaughter or a niece. And I got through it because she would hold my prosthesis. Wherever they went out, she would hold the prosthesis, but he didn't have any touch. He said, I can't wait for the day until I can feel her holding that connection. And he says, I want to hold my wife's hand. While touch has a functional value, we've talked a lot about that in this conversation, it's really about emotion.
My wife traveled to Washington with me to a conference. First time she had seen the system since I had it implanted. I have the system turned on, I'm meeting people and shaking hands and this, that, and the other, and she comes to the door, so she reaches out and she grabs my hand. And we hugged. I grabbed her arm and I petted it just so I could feel her skin. I was whole, I was complete. This is a tool. When the system's turned on, it's mine, it's my hand. What this system done personally for me, it takes the touch and turns it to an emotional feeling, a physical touch to an emotional feeling.
That's fantastic. Professor Dustin Tyler, who's the director of the Functional Neural Interface Lab, and he's also the director of the Human Fusions Institute at Case Western Reserve University. Dustin, thank you so very, very much for being here today.
Thank you, Shelly. I really appreciate it. It's exciting.
It is exciting. Thanks again, Dustin. And thanks to all of you for being here. I hope you enjoyed your time with us today. If you'd like more information, please visit humanfusions.org. For our friends here at Case Western Reserve University, I'm Shelly Palmer. Stay safe.